Oh, sorry, Claire.
Try to share the slide to get us going. Hopefully this will work. Can people see that?
Yeah, if you just go on to slide share, Claire, that's great. Perfect.
There we go. Okay.
And William, you just take your microphone off. That's super.
And William, if you just want to let me know whenever the next slide is needed, and I'll hit.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll mute myself
now. Good morning. My name is William Johnston. I'm a dialysis patient, but I'm also now transplanted. I got my second kidney transplant 7 years ago. But I was on dialysis for a continuous of 17 years. So whenever I do a presentation, I call it a life on dialysis because that's what it felt like. I also kind of call it dying to live because every time you do a session of dialysis, it takes something out of your body. And it was just kind of dying as in dialysis. So next, Claire. This is the beginning of my renal journey. I was born with a kidney defect and I had an operation when I was 3 years old. It was very successful and I went and led a normal life, doing O-levels, A-levels, degree, went over to London. And then at the age of 25, my renal failure caught up with me and I started CIP dialysis in London, but I didn't want to stay there alone, so I came back to Northern Ireland. Next. So I came back to Northern Ireland and I was on CIPD for 6 months. And fortunately, I also got a transplant in 1995. Unfortunately, the kidney transplant, it never took. There was always partial rejection and it rejected after 2 years. So I started dialysis again in 1997. Next slide, please. So this is what I first started on. It's the APD, ambulatory peritoneal dialysis. It's done through a tube in the stomach called catheter, and it does the job of the kidney by removing fluids and waste by osmosis. It's done overnight, takes 10 hours, and it's done every night of the week. And I did that for 2 years until I wasn't getting enough dialysis through the catheter. And I was unfortunately forced to go into hospital hemodialysis, which I knew that I wouldn't enjoy because I was going to be tied to a hospital unit. Next, Claire. So this is the hospital hemodialysis. This is my bed in the Belfast City Hospital renal unit. I had to attend this 3 times a week, every week of the year, and I did that for 6 years. And you don't get away from it ever. It was exceedingly boring. I had to just lie there 4.5 hours and watch daytime television, which was driving me mad. Just living in hope of a transplant, waiting for the telephone to go and waiting for that call. But the call just wouldn't come. Unfortunately, my first transplant gave me sensitized me with a lot of antibodies, which meant it was very, very hard for me to get matched. The live donor program had just come in about around that stage, but no live donor could be found for me because of these antibodies. My mother wasn't compatible, my twin brother wasn't compatible. So I just really started getting tired of going to hospital, being under their control. So I was offered the chance of doing home hemodialysis. Claire? So this is home hemodialysis, where I was taught how to do hemodialysis by myself at home. It was tremendous. It was a godsend to my psychological mental health. It meant that I took control. It meant I could do it whenever I wanted. I didn't have to go to hospital. The condition, my life was controlled. It gave me flexibility. The condition didn't control me. I controlled the condition. We got a room converted in the house, and I was taught how to do the hemodialysis. The hardest thing was to put the needles into myself, but I overcame that. So we got the room developed, and I was convinced that I was going to get another transplant once we had the room transformed and once I was trained. Unfortunately, again, that didn't happen, and I was on hemodialysis for another 9 years, living in hope. of a transplant. I was actually told by a consultant that I wasn't going to get a transplant because it's too sensitized. And again, that just really affected my psychological health and mental health. Next, Claire. Amazingly, I did get the gift of life in 2014. It wasn't a good match, but it was all that I was ever going to get. The consultant said that she wouldn't think that I might get many years out of it. But I celebrated my 7th year anniversary of the kidney transplant. So the consultant is very pleased with that. Next, Claire. Whenever I first started, my first consultant told me, dialyze to live, don't live to dialyze. And that's the motto that I tried to stay throughout dialysis. And what he was trying to tell me was, don't let dialysis take your life over. Try and have some kind of life while you're on dialysis. So that's what I did. Next slide. So I went on holidays, but I still had to dialyze even on holiday. So I'd have to go to, I went to different places like Crete and Spain and Tenerife and Italy, but I always had to go to dialysis 3 times during holiday. Also on dialysis, you're on a very strict fluid restriction. So on holiday, I decided that I would let my hair down, if I had any, and drink fluid. And I enjoyed lots of cocktails and enjoyed as much as I could. Next slide. I became involved with the local charities. I became involved with Northern Ireland Kidney Patient Association. That's me throwing at one of the games. I did the Life Cycles, which was a tandem cycle ride around the 7 units of Northern Ireland to try and raise awareness of organ donation. I did the marathon as well. Okay, next clip. But having done all that, I'd lost hope. And I really was suffering mentally and psychologically from waiting for a transplant for all those years. And thankfully, in 2016, by a chance meeting with Dr. Helen Noble from Queen's University Belfast, I'd said to her that I'd written poetry while I was on dialysis. And this poetry, it was very, very dark and emotional. And there was about 24 of them. Next, Claire. This is the loss of hope can drive a person insane. It was 24 poems written on dialysis. It was a line taken from a film that I really started to like and watch because I could empathize with it. It was called The Shawshank Redemption, about somebody being in prison. And there's a line in it that says, the loss of hope can drive a man insane. And I thought that's exactly how I felt. I'd lost hope of ever getting a transplant and lost hope of everything. And so a lot of the poems kind of tracks my emotional journey through dialysis. And Dr. Helen Noble recognized the potential of these poems, of how they could benefit other patients and medical staff. And she began the Reading Arts Group in 2016. And we were joined shortly by Dr. Claire Carswell, who has been doing amazing work with the arts intervention in the hemodialysis units. And Kidney Care UK, from Advocacy Officer 4, we were able to fund for an administrator, Anna Wilson, who has absolutely been tremendous in driving the arts movement through for the last few years. Next slide. On dialysis, I wrote a play called The Gift of Donation. And again, this follows 3 patients on the day that called for a possible transplant. And again, it's quite an emotional read. It tried to highlight what the emotional feelings of being called for a transplant and waiting to find out if it's your transplant or not. The way they used to work there was that they call 3 people, but only 1 person would get the transplant, and the other 2 people would have to go home. And unfortunately, that happened to me on 4 different occasions, where I went to the city hospital and you wait there for 6-7 hours, do all the tests, and unfortunately the nurse comes in and says, "Sorry, William, it's not your kidney. The tissue matching isn't good." And it's quite devastating. You think you're going to get your transplant, you're going to get your freedom. Unfortunately, you're just sent home again. Next. So this is the latest play that I've been writing, and it's called The Starman, the Superhero and the Wizards. and it's been funded by the Arts Council of Northern Ireland. Mentor Shannon Ree, who's a world-renowned playwright who wrote Reassemble Slightly Askew about brain injury. The title is that the Starman is actually the transplant recipient, because I discovered that through those 17 years of dialysis, I've got a lot of physical scars on arms, necks, stomach. So it was just by changing one letter in Starman to C, you get scar. So the transplant recipient is the Starman. The superhero is of course, is the donor. And the wizards is the medical surgeons that put the kidney in, and the mental wizard, somebody that can look after my head or my mind. And that's the mind wizard. It's well underway of being produced. We've got a second read through with well-known Northern Irish actors this Friday. It's going to be performed by Zoom, which is very exciting. It was going to be in a Belfast theatre in last October, but of course COVID intervened. But hopefully, whenever this COVID is under control, maybe we can get into theatre for a live performance at the end of the year. Next. So the present, next, Claire. That's me doing my day job. That's the Advocacy Officer with Kidney Care UK. Because of my journey through dialysis, I'm able to assist and support a lot of renal patients around the 7 renal units of Northern Ireland, which gives me great satisfaction. And fortunately, because of COVID, I've been shielding for the last year or so. So I look forward to getting back out to the renal units. And that was last summer with my wife and myself. I competed in the Transplant Games and won a medal in the swimming. Next. And that's a picture of me with lots of hair, and actually just to prove what I was like before renal failure. I was a very sporting rugby fella, but I always kind of show that picture just because it kind of motivates me to say, well, I can take everything on head first and overcome all challenges. One regret is that I just wish that there'd been an arts intervention like Claire's while I was doing the dialysis all those years. The arts intervention in the hemodialysis units, I really feel is so beneficial to the patient's psychological well-being, and I also believe the medical staff, and it takes a lot out of it as well. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Oh, I can hear myself back. So I'm now just going to give an overview of what we've actually been doing in the Northern Trust that William has touched on, and thank you so much for that, William. I think that gives a good idea about the reality of living with kidney disease and how difficult it can be to cope with the treatment that you have to go through. So part of the Renal Arts Group's aim is to develop the evidence base for using art to promote the mental health and well-being of people who are impacted by kidney disease. And as a result of that, the Renal Arts Group were able to obtain funding for a PhD project that was looking at the feasibility of an arts-based intervention for patients with end-stage kidney disease whilst they receive hemodialysis. And I was lucky enough to be awarded that studentship to actually conduct that study. Now, going forward, I just want to clarify what we mean whenever we say arts-based interventions, because I know whenever it comes to mental health, some of the terms can be quite easily confused. So when I say arts-based intervention, what I mean is the use of art in a healthcare context for the purpose of creativity and enjoyment. We're not talking about art therapy because we're not using a trained art therapist, we're not using a psychotherapeutic framework, and we're not actually trying to meet a clinical objective. We're not trying to treat anything with these arts-based interventions. But as William has already touched on, art is actually quite ideally placed to address some of the more difficult issues associated with treatments like hemodialysis. Now, there is a significant lack of evidence in arts and health in general, but also in hemodialysis settings. So the first step of the project was actually to develop an arts-based intervention that could be safely implemented in such a highly specialised clinical area like William has just shown, but could also be implemented in a way that we could evaluate it within a randomised controlled trial to build up that evidence base. The framework that we used to develop the intervention was Daisy Fancourt's Arts and Health Framework, which she published in 2017. It's a framework that was designed specifically to develop arts and health programs or arts and health interventions. It's very flexible, it's very iterative, and it doesn't really have like a prescriptive methodology. So I'm just going to go through some of the steps that we took to actually address the core components of that framework. So the first step that we took was established an interdisciplinary advisory group. This consisted of patients, healthcare professionals, artists, and academics, and they were able to advise on sort of practical aspects of the intervention. So how could we safely deliver it in a clinical setting? How could we make people interested in it? How could we adapt it to meet individual patient needs? Things like that. But they were also able to advise on issues around the randomized control trial. So how can we standardize this to an extent that we can actually evaluate it within a trial? And I cannot overstate how crucial that group were. Hugh was a member, as was William, in terms of actually developing an intervention that worked really well in practice and also designing a protocol for the trial that worked really well. The second step then was the review of the evidence base. So we conducted 2 systematic literature reviews and a realist synthesis. This helped us identify core components that have been used in arts and health programs previously in hemodialysis units in practice, but also helped identify some mechanisms through which we would actually impact on mental health outcomes. The third step was then shadowing target groups. And how we did this was I essentially visited hemodialysis units at Belfast City Hospital and at Antrim Area Hospital, where we did the feasibility study, just to chat with patients, with healthcare professionals, to see what they thought of art on dialysis. I was also able to shadow an artist in residence who was providing arts to patients in hemodialysis units at Belfast City Hospital through arts care. And that was really good because I could see how they approached the arts in the setting, but also it gave me an opportunity to talk to people who really didn't want to take part, to see why they didn't want to take part and to figure out if there was any way that we could tweak what we were doing to make it more appealing to more people. The fourth step was I had to develop my own personal arts practice because I was going to be the person to deliver this intervention, which meant I kind of had to know what I was doing. But this also helped me sort of draw on personal experience and stuff whenever it came to actually delivering the intervention. And then the final step was identifying a theory that could underpin this intervention as a whole. And this was informed by the advisory group, by the review of the evidence, and also from my personal arts practice. And the theory that we arrived at was the theory of flow. And flow is very closely tied to arts as is because it was developed by a positive psychologist called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who developed it after watching artists at work. So the idea of flow is that it's a theory of optimal engagement. So you're completely engaged in the activity that you are taking part in and you enter into a flow state. And this means that you stop paying attention to everything around you, you stop thinking, so you're not ruminating, you're not worrying. And one key aspect of flow that we thought would be particularly beneficial for patients was that it actually alters your perception of time. So people typically report that time passes a lot quicker than it actually is. And for patients on hemodialysis who spend most of the treatment just watching the clock count down, that in and of itself could be incredibly beneficial to their mental well-being. Now, the intervention that we ended up developing involved 6 one-hour-long, one-to-one facilitated art sessions at the patient's bedside during their hemodialysis treatment. And these happened twice a week for 3 weeks for every participant who took part. Each participant got their own individual arts pack with all of the materials that they would need. So this meant we could work within infection control protocols, but it also meant that patients got to keep all of the art materials that they used during the intervention. Patients then also got a choice between either visual art or creative writing, and they could choose between different types of visual art and different types of creative writing. And then they could self-identify a subject matter that they wanted to focus on or choose from a series of prompts. So it was very flexible, it was very person-centered, but each participant got the same set of choices, they got the same materials, and every session focused on developing patients' artistic skills so that we could standardize it to some extent. Now, the feasibility study itself involved a pilot cluster randomized control trial and a process evaluation. The pilot cluster randomized control trial really focused on seeing if we could recruit people into the study, if we could keep people in the study, and to see whether or not people would actually adhere to the intervention, if they would stick with it. We could also trial a few of the study processes, so things like randomization procedures and the collection of outcome measures. Going into the study, we set a target sample size of 30, and we wanted to recruit at least 75% of that target sample size. We also wanted to make sure that we could keep at least 80% of the participants that we did recruit in the study through until the end to say that it was feasible. The process evaluation then involved qualitative interviews with patients and healthcare professionals to explore their experience of the arts-based intervention and the trial processes as well, and to see whether or not they were acceptable for both patients and staff. In terms of the results of the pilot cluster randomized control trial, we were able to recruit 24 patients into the study, and we were also able to randomize them so that there were 12 in the intervention group and 12 in the control group. Now, 24 meant that we had recruited 80% of our target sample size, so that implies that it is feasible to recruit to a definitive trial. In terms of attrition, we had to withdraw 3 participants during the study, and that resulted in an attrition rate of 12.5%, which again suggests that we can retain participants in a definitive trial. But it's also important to think about why people were withdrawing from the study or were being withdrawn from the study, because that can also speak to feasibility. So in this situation, all of the participants who were withdrawn because of their physical health deteriorating. 2 participants became too unwell to continue, and then 1 participant sadly died just prior to final follow-up. So this implies 2 different things. First of all, it tells us that the intervention and the trial processes are likely very feasible and very acceptable, because no one withdrew from the study because they didn't like the intervention or because the trial processes were too burdensome. But it also tells us that this patient population are very unwell, they're very frail, and they have high levels of morbidity. So we would expect to have a high attrition rate. And we need to account for that going forward in terms of sample size calculations and how long our longitudinal follow-up would be in a definitive trial. In terms of intervention adherence and whether or not people stuck with the intervention, we didn't actually set a threshold for this, because there actually is very limited literature on arts-based interventions, and we don't know what the adequate dose would be to actually have an impact on mental health outcomes. But I don't think it really mattered that we didn't set a threshold, because we ended up with a 100% completion rate. Every participant who started the intervention completed the full 6 sessions of the intervention. They didn't miss a single one. So that was a very nice result to get at the end. The process evaluation results, we did interviews with 22 people, both patients and healthcare professionals, and then we thematically analysed them, and we identified 4 overarching themes. The first theme was the perception of art participation, both before, during, and after the intervention, because patients report that their perception did change. The second was the acceptability of the arts-based intervention, and the third was the acceptability of the research procedures, and then the fourth was the effect of the arts-based intervention on both patients and healthcare professionals. Now, I don't have time to go into detail in any of these, but I do want to talk about 2 findings that we got in relation to the acceptability of the arts-based intervention, because they had a big influence on what we ended up doing next. So the first one that I want to mention is the sub-theme that related to the length of the intervention. So as you can probably tell from having a 100% completion rate for an intervention, this was a highly acceptable intervention. Patients and healthcare professionals really enjoyed it. However, there was one criticism that we got consistently across every interview that we did for the process evaluation, and that was that it wasn't long enough. Patients wanted more sessions and they wanted longer sessions. In fact, the way that healthcare professionals and patients spoke about it made it seem like they actually wanted it in standard practice without an end date, so sort of just to continue indefinitely, which has implications going forward, because costing an intervention that is 3 weeks long or 6 weeks long or 10 weeks long or even 16 weeks long is very different to costing an intervention that is expected to be standard practice and just continue in perpetuity. So we need to take that into consideration going forward. The second sub-theme was about the importance of the facilitator. So both patients and healthcare professionals emphasized the fact that the facilitator was essential for delivering this intervention. That was in terms of engagement, actually making sure people were taking part and were enjoying it. Also in terms of just practical support. So a lot of patients had limited upper body mobility and they just needed someone there at the bedside. But also a lot of the benefits that we wanted patients to experience came about because of that almost like teacher-student relationship and the skill development focus. So we needed a facilitator. However, I was the facilitator for every single session in this intervention, and I am not a professional artist. And this, again, has implications going forward, because traditionally in arts and medicine programs, you would find that professional artists would be the ones to deliver the intervention. They would facilitate it. What we showed was that actually patients can engage very well, and they can experience numerous benefits from an intervention that is delivered by someone who isn't a professional. So again, we have to take that into consideration going forward. So what does that mean in terms of next steps? Well, we found that the intervention and the trial were feasible, so we are developing a proposal to conduct a multi-site cluster randomized controlled trial. However, something sort of unanticipated that came out of this feasibility study was the fact that we created a demand for an intervention that people didn't know that they wanted to begin with, and then when we took it away, they really missed it. So we created this need that we had to address in terms of actually getting the arts back into practice as quickly as possible, regardless of the trial that was happening. And in terms of what I just mentioned in relation to the fact that patients wanted this to continue in practice indefinitely, as did healthcare professionals, and also the fact that we found that we didn't need necessarily to hire a professional artist to deliver this sort of intervention, the interdisciplinary advisory group came together and came up with the idea of using volunteers to deliver this intervention. And we were fortunate enough to actually get funding from the ESRC to develop guidance to come up with a strategy on how to use volunteers to deliver this intervention. And we've been working very closely with the Northern Trust to do this. So now I'm just going to pass over to Hugh Nelson, who's the Community Wellbeing Manager in the Northern Trust and has been involved in this project, I think, from the very start of the feasibility study, and he's going to bring us all up to speed on what we're doing now. Hugh, would you want me to stop sharing the screen? Would that be easier? Hugh?
That's me now. Yes, go ahead. Stop sharing. That's grand. Yep. Okay, thank you, William and Claire, and I'll pick up from here. So thank you all very much for the opportunity to speak about this renal arts project. As head of community wellbeing for the Northern Health and Social Care Trust, my responsibilities include arts and wellbeing, but this is an area I think that we have touched on already that requires much nurturing. It's been a privilege to be involved with this initiative. So let me set out 4 reasons why I consider this to be one of the most valuable arts and wellbeing projects that I've been involved with. So the importance of this project to our Northern Area Arts and Wellbeing strategy covers 4 areas. 1, it brings value recognition through evidence. Also, it demonstrates that art works in a highly controlled clinical environment. Thirdly, it offers sustainability and spread. And finally, it brings clear benefits to patients who participate and the potential for sharing their experiences with the wider public. So let me elaborate a little on each of these. In terms of the value recognition through evidence, this is critical. Arts and wellbeing is a significantly undervalued area of public health. I'm very conscious of the many benefits of physical health and mental health and social well-being that arts and health activities bring. So I can't fully explain why it is so undervalued, but I can clearly demonstrate that it is undervalued. Well, first of all, there is no regional arts and wellbeing strategy within Northern Ireland. Only 2 of the 5 trusts have their own local strategies, and only 3 have got dedicated arts and wellbeing posts within their health improvement teams. In the 2 other trusts, arts and wellbeing is an add-on to an existing post. So with no regional strategy, no regional funding to establish a consistent approach, arts and wellbeing is unlike other areas of public health, such as obesity, child development. It doesn't have that same focus, it doesn't have that same level of investment, but yet it is very highly critically beneficial to patients, and we have heard from William earlier about some of the benefits that will be being derived for him, and Claire demonstrated through the evidence on her research how beneficial it would be. So arts and well-being is too often dependent on individuals taking forward due to their own personal interest. And if this interest is missing, it may not happen. That should not be the case when it is clear that there are many physical, mental, and social benefits to be derived from engaging in the arts as part of someone's treatment, care, and recovery. And while we were developing our Northern Trust Arts and Wellbeing strategy, it became very clear that we needed to increase the understanding of the connection between arts and individual well-being. We needed to make our case. And our strategy notes that recent research and evidence-based practice has shown that arts can make a major contribution to both the prevention of ill health and the treatment and management of long-term conditions. And there is evidence there, such as the Creative Health UK All-Party Inquiry report of 2017, which makes a strong case with many examples. But to help raise the standing of arts and wellbeing, we also needed local evidence gathering, and not just the positive testimonials that we would often feature in our annual arts and wellbeing report, but also rigorous, independent academic research. And this project offered that, with the focus of Claire's PhD has the weight and scrutiny, rigor of academic research through the QUB School of Nursing Midwifery. Strong evidence for learning, placing arts and wellbeing alongside other areas of evidence for public health approaches. The second benefit really is about how art works in a clinically controlled environment. Renal dialysis is a controlled clinical environment that requires guard against infection to the highest standard. Receiving dialysis is prolonged, is physically restrictive to the individual, and by the nature of the intervention inhibits other activities occurring at the same time. Dialysis is life-sustaining and essential, but the nature of the treatment is often grueling. From the perspective of the potential benefits to patients, you probably couldn't pick a more suitable clinical area, as patients experience that existential boredom which can impact adversely on their mental health. But from the perspective of a managed clinical area, you probably couldn't have picked a more intrusive wellbeing intervention than having patients produce their own art. Patients are confined to bed, connected to a dialysis machine. It's an environment where patients have restricted upper mobility and often experience fatigue. And the challenges associated that were many and required to be worked through with staff on the wards and with others with wider infection control responsibility within the trust. It required a compromise and adjustment of the arts intervention as clinical quality needed to be maintained. And what was needed was a positive and creative commitment to making it work, recognizing the benefits to patients of making it happen. The good news is that this hard work has been done and is documented and is available. And if arts and wellbeing interventions can take place within a renal unit, then they can take place in many other parts of the hospital, and in many instances would be much easier to deliver. The next area I want to touch on is the issue of sustainability and spread. And it's important that when we identify good practice, when we see how a demand has been created, that we put in place arrangements to ensure that this initiative is sustainable and potentially can be spread to other similar environments. This often brings challenges, and as we've all seen pilot initiatives which attract excitement and applause, but actually not the full commitment to sustain and extend. And there are often real barriers, such as funding, key people inevitably moving on, etc. This year, the pandemic became yet another such barrier. But accepting these is unassailable isn't how you build an acceptance of arts and well-being as a high-value public health intervention. People will quite reasonably ask if this really was such good practice, then why did it stop? But taking a strategic approach requires not leaving sustainability and spread the serendipity, but rather to take a resolute approach to ensuring that we not only identify best practice, but we commit to and achieve sustainability, and we encourage spread. And there's a really good team behind this project, and we have found ways of making it sustainable. Our main solution focuses around the use of volunteers, people with an interest in arts and well-being, and above all, an empathy for people undergoing dialysis. We have established volunteer roles where volunteers engage with patients and clients in activities often music-related. We have those already in our trust, and they're there in others. And we also have volunteers who support, comfort, and befriend patients receiving care. So the Renal Arts Project offered the opportunity to extend volunteering to support people receiving dialysis. It's a role very well suited to volunteers, and as always with volunteering, the key is to ensuring that there's good support wrapped around each volunteer. It's having each volunteer with a feeling of being supported, connected, and that's what keeps them involved and helps them receive the benefits that they derive through the volunteering. We have sourced MayWe as an organisation who can oversee the development of volunteering and bring experience of both arts and organisation, including working with volunteers. We've had to adapt how it works to make it suitable for volunteers, and we've had to adapt it again to make it suitable to work remotely and in future on the ward. And we've made arrangements to cover technology, to increase technology on the ward. And we've developed the protocols which cover both the scenarios of working remotely and on the ward. So we are ready to adapt as we move forward. And adapting to circumstance, putting in place the arrangements for sustaining this activity for patients is key to making this successful, and documenting it as we go so it can be easily shared and applied to renal units elsewhere. I mean, none of this would have been worth doing if it had not been evidence as being beneficial to patients. And the evidence that you've heard today has very clearly shown that this is the case, how encouraging this activity can be, and how hopeful we are that this will become something that will be sustained going forward. It's clearly a demand that is there from the people who have received it, and it's our responsibility to make sure that we put that in place. And this isn't about producing artwork. The benefit of the act of producing the artwork makes as much difference to the people who experience most of us generally know very little about. And the project offers the opportunity to share not just a template, how to bring arts and wellbeing into other renal units. It also holds the potential for sharing with the wider public the experience of dialysis and why the transport programme is so important. In summary, this initiative has shown me the importance of applying evidence-based research to arts in the renal unit and provided a legacy of documentation and goodwill, which will enable the project to keep growing. It has been both a pleasure and an education to be involved, and added real strength to development of our arts and wellbeing strategy into effective delivery, and further step into greater recognition of the value of arts in improving public health. Thank you.
Thank you, William, Claire and Hugh, for your very thoughtful presentations. I think that this study in particular really speaks to the power of such a collaborative approach to research, and also speaks to the success of the Renal Arts Group that I know you're all members of. So I would like to ask our attendees if they would like to come forward with questions. Please do raise your hand, and we'll invite you in. I'm going to try and keep an eye on that, or if you'd prefer, please do put your comments in the question box and I can forward the questions in. If I could start the questions, if that's okay. One of the things, Hugh, I just wanted to ask you about is how important is it whenever we're thinking about practice and policy and what we change within practice, how important has it been working in this partnership model with this programme of research so that it can shape policy and practice moving forward?
Well, I think the partnership collaborative approach was absolutely vital. You needed the combination of the skills, knowledge and expertise that is involved in this. You've heard there from William today about that lived experience, and what we do is driven by understanding the lived experience and recognizing how we can help people such as William and others with their lived experience. And also I highlighted the fact that we need very strong evidence around arts and well-being, and therefore we needed Claire, we needed Helen, Anna and all the others. We needed the weight of the research work that is brought through the involvement of Claire and others from Queen's in this project, because we needed to demonstrate and show, not just for our own understanding of how we adapt and change and modify, but actually our starting point is very clearly that arts and well-being is a really undervalued area of public health. Public health is my sort of area of responsibility. And when I look at how it sits alongside the research that's gone into so many other areas of activity, there's not enough evidence base there, and we need to invest in and grow that evidence base. And this is a terrific sort of step towards that. And actually, it's very important for me. And whenever we launched our arts and well-being strategy, which took place, I think it was about a week or so before lockdown last March, I was really pleased and delighted that Claire was able to speak at it and actually demonstrate that arts and well-being can stand up to that level of scrutiny, that level of peer review, that level of evaluation that shows actually this works. And that's critically important. And that can only be done through a collaborative approach. That isn't something that the trust can do by itself. That is something that we all have to be part of a partnership in doing.
Thanks very much, Hugh. And William, if I could ask you then, I know that obviously you're working as an advocacy officer with Kidney Care UK. How important is it to be involved in designing research and thinking about how Kidney Care UK can influence the research agenda so that the research that is conducted is impactful and makes a difference?
I think it's vital. Certainly for it to be patient-centred, where patients are at the core of the research as well. So Kidney Care UK and the Northern Ireland Kidney Patients Association are absolutely delighted to be involved and to participate. And it's great when patients are always remembered and put at the centre of things. I'd also like to say that I add to the benefits of the arts is that whenever I was getting involved in my plays and my poetry, I actually looked forward to dialysis, which I thought, isn't that amazing to actually look forward to a treatment? But I was so involved in what I was creating, and it was the creativity that, and as Claire says, the time flew by for me. And I actually looked forward to a dialysis day because that was my 4 hours of my time, and I could just concentrate on getting my play down. And it was something tangible from the time spent on dialysis. So it wasn't wasted. And I just felt, oh my goodness, this is just wonderful that I can actually be something creative and tangible can come out of my time on dialysis. So going back to what you're saying about Kidney Care UK, absolutely delighted to be involved in the research. I know that other advocacy officers from around the UK are very much interested in doing something similar. I know there's a couple of them on this meeting. So it really is going to be a successful intervention if it's fully supported and funded.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, William. Gillian Prue, I see, has a question. Come on ahead, Gillian.
Hi, hello everybody. I just wanted to say that it really totally fantastic. Really loved the presentations from someone who doesn't come from any sort of an artistic or arts background. I just thought it's fantastic, and it had such a positive impact on everyone. I suppose the question I was wondering, and I'm sure you have thought about this and spoke about it, are there other patients and other groups that this could apply to, particularly patients who maybe do spend a long time in hospital, and maybe it does already happen? Thoughts obviously with the cancer centre and patients on chemotherapy for a long time, and I'm sure there's other patient groups that could really benefit from it.
Yeah, I'll say a little something. So yeah, I was actually speaking to Helen about this the other day, and I think there are a few other patient groups, especially patients, like you mentioned, with cancer. The systematic reviews that we did, one was in bone marrow transplants, because obviously that requires extended hospitalization and people are very isolated. So this could very easily translate across. And I think for patients who are hospitalized long-term or who face a difficult treatment, this, like the mechanisms that we showed how art worked on dialysis, should translate across. I think dialysis is quite unique in terms of how relentless and long-term it is, because people, I mean, a lot of the patients who took part in the study, they didn't have any prospective transplants, so they have to do that 3 times a week, 4 hours each time for the rest of their life. So it's quite unique in that way, but the mechanism should still translate across, especially with like the guidance that we developed. We're developing in a way that we're hoping to do it remotely. So like patients who are immunocompromised, who are, again, with bone marrow transplants keep coming to the front of my mind, but who maybe can't see other people, there'll be something there and an option to distract themselves and to get into those flow states and to improve their well-being. So it should translate across.
I could just add briefly to that. Yes, I'd agree there would be potential for translation across. We have a Macmillan unit for cancer patients on the Antrim Mary Hospital site. They have very strong active volunteering base. And that's what I think is one of the beauties of working in this project, is the way it has been evaluated, it's been documented. So it actually is going to be fairly straightforward process of having that engagement with the likes of the Macmillan unit about the potential for bringing this into their area. So I think absolutely that's another way we want to move this forward in the future. Thank you.
There's a question there from Anna.
Anna, yes, sorry, I'm just going to pick up on that. Claire, if you could tell us a little bit about what are going to be the next steps in your work. How is it going to be expanded?
So as I've sort of mentioned, there's 2 different approaches that we're taking in terms of getting it into practice now as soon as possible with the work that we're doing with the Northern Trust and the ESRC guidance that we're developing, but we're also trying to run a larger trial at some point. So we are developing a proposal to do like a multi-site cluster randomized controlled trial. It will have to be across the UK because we need a good few renal units to establish the efficacy of these interventions and actually improving measurable, quantifiable outcomes. And the hope then is that through like a cost effectiveness evaluation as well, we'll be able to show that not only is it effective, but it's worth whatever money that we're spending on it to improve patient well-being and mental health. And then it could almost be like taken up as practice within the NHS across the UK, because at the moment, most practice in terms of arts and health on dialysis, it's very sort of not segregated, but it's very sort of compartmentalized. There's maybe a little bit of practice going on over here or a little bit going on here, but it's not joined up. So if we could have like a national policy, that would be amazing. But that's, in terms of the evidence base, that's the next step.
Sorry, I'm just going to pick up Adele's question here. Has there been any collaboration with occupational therapy?
Yeah, well, yes and no. So there aren't actually a lot of OTs that specialise in renal or who work in renal hemodialysis units. I don't think there's any in Northern Ireland, but there are a few OTs who specialise in dialysis in England. I'm thinking Lisa Ancliffe. and we've written a few articles together, and she's also trying to get ART established in her units over there through occupational therapy. Because even though traditionally that wouldn't necessarily be the role of the occupational therapist in renal, that I come from a mental health background, and that would very much be in the remit in terms of art and meaningful activity. So she is definitely working in her unit on trying to get it established there. And we have been linking up for National UK Kidney Week every year with the Renal Arts Group and Lisa and Ellen's work as well, to have an exhibition of patients' work. And William has submitted a few poems and things, I think, before. William, if you want to say a few words about the UK Kidney Week collaborations.
Yes, I think we attended the one in Brighton. I think is that 2 years ago now, or 1 year? 2 years? 2 years, 2 years ago. Yeah, it got very good feedback and response. We had my poetry displayed on the wall. A lot of medical staff came along and seemed to be very interested. It gave them an insight into what patients are going through when they're on dialysis. Again, it's a shame that there wasn't more psychological support for me while I was going through this. So hopefully something like other patients won't have to suffer psychological distress like I did, and trying to cope by writing poetry. This arts intervention by Claire will be so beneficial to current patients and future patients, and I can only advocate it highly enough.
Thanks so much, William. And I see there's a comment from Adele about cancer survivors. I think that there could be great work there. And yes, from my background as well, particularly in haematology, and people who would be having stem cell transplants and would have long periods of isolation, I can see its applicability in those areas as well. So can I just ask then, are there any closing questions for our speakers? Okay, well then I would like to just say, I just want to thank everyone so much for both your company and also for your questions today that helped make this a really interesting session. But I really want to say a special thanks to our presenters, to Hugh, to Claire and to William. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really clear to see the passion that you have for this work. And it's been wonderful to have you here today. We're really very grateful for your time. And we really want to see how this work transforms healthcare, how it moves forward, and we're very supportive of that work. And yes, Helen, I agree, we'll try and convince NIHR. So just to say to everyone, thank you so much for your time, take good care, and we'll see you all very soon. Bye.